Well, we got 300 or 400 charts from the University of Michigan healthcare system, and then we divided these charts into psychiatric charts, medical charts, and control charts. And what we saw was that we did a kind of similar study where we divided into a coding for DSM criteria versus non-DSM criteria, and then asked, were there similar trends to what was happening in popular culture, happening in doctors' dictations of medical charts and medical in medical charts in the medical system. Now, the data I'm going to show you is just from the psychiatric charts, because that's where we saw the most kind of prevalent information. Certainly, as you might expect, the psychiatric charts, basically every single one of them hit 100% in the use of DSM terms. So people would use DSM terms to dictate. Doctors would say things like, she has symptoms of major depression, she knows increased fatigue, decreased energy, et cetera, et cetera. That's not very surprising because that's how people dictate. But we also saw pretty striking patterns in the use of cultural terms in reference to women's and men's depression. Now, this is the graph for women's depression. And what you can see is that, especially in this mauve group, there's a steady rate raise from about 45 or 50% upwards to basically every single chart that we coded in the year 2000 that somehow referenced women's depression, not in relation to work or other kinds of things, but in relation to their positions as women in relationships, basically. That was becoming increasingly prevalent over the course of the Prozac phenomenon. Here are a few examples. Medical charts are obviously much more complicated than popular media. The patient states that her husband died 4 years ago. Within 5 weeks, she started seeing another man who was the husband's cousin. She broke up with her boyfriend. She states that she has difficulty keeping up with her daily tasks at home. She enjoyed being with her children, but does not like spending time at home with her family. So increasing references in these dictations to similar cultural themes as we were seeing in the media. Now here's the graph for men. And you can see that it's pretty random. It's not the kind of strike home point, but there were statistically significant trends happening in relation to men, but not in relation to their roles in relationships. Instead, for men, it was almost globally in relation to either aggression or sports. And so you would see things like he complains having difficulty focusing on his PhD work, which is understandable for many of us. There were some things about relationships as well, but my personal favorite, he began having doubts about his sexual performance and about the size of his penis and whether he could satisfy a woman. He has continued to ruminate and obsess about his sexual performance. It has been distracting at work. And for any of us who have ruminated about our penis while we're trying to work, it's actually very hard to work that way. Now, let me just say one thing about this, which is that we felt like we had a pretty strong argument here in this particular way, which is that we had done two studies here, basically. The first study, we invented a new coding mechanism. We invented a new mode of study. And what we did was then send it out for publication. And the first study, the media study, not only got accepted, I think within like 14.5 minutes of being submitted, it appeared in Social Science and Medicine, but when it came out, our findings were reproduced very, very broadly. Everything from Psychiatric Times, numerous psychiatry websites. I was actually, talk about this later, but I was interviewed by the Canadian Broadcasting Company, but it was like in 15 different areas, so I had to do the exact same interview 15 times, which is really a kind of funny thing. But we got tons and tons and tons of press. It got published right away, lots of response. Now, this is just me having sour grapes. I've been promoted. I don't, like my career's not resting on it or something like that. But I would say that what we did then was use exactly the same method. In fact, a method that we'd already published one study off of, and then tried to have the chart study published. And the findings were incredibly different, and that it was rejected from 15 medical journals in a row, which we thought was, on one hand you could say, well, you all of a sudden became a really crappy writer, or you weren't using methods. But the thing was, we were using exactly the same methods. But what was interesting for us as we kind of intellectualize our own disappointment about this particular issue was the reason people were rejecting us was There's little doubt that advertisements have contributed to the numbers of prescriptions, People kept saying there's no impact that we can find of advertisements. But we tried to make really, really clear in our study that we actually weren't talking about advertisements. We weren't talking about advertisements at all. But every one of the rejections kept saying, you can't prove the impact of advertisements. So in a way, as our way of kind of making a funny PowerPoint slide to talk about this is that people were kind of reading this through a particular cultural script. And the script of blaming the media was a very easy argument to make. But the idea that doctors might be reflecting cultural mores in the process of medicalization was one that happily we're going to get accepted now in, I think, a humanities journal, if everything else works. But it was one that was much more difficult for people to hear. So with that in mind, I just want to conclude with several points about why I think this kind of sociocultural research is important. The first gets back to what I was saying before, which is that definitely medicalization and problematic medicalizing images and representations are being construed in corporate boardrooms and in advertising agencies, and it's something that, for better or worse, we always have to be aware of as clinicians. But at the same time, this narrative of just blaming the drug companies makes it harder for us to see how we are all part of a bigger series of popular cultures, and that medicalization also tells us something about our own biases, our own stereotypes, our own blind spots. And I think that's a very important point. When I use advertisements, for example, in my teaching in medical schools, I often use them as teaching points to tell people, what is being constructed here? What is it that it's easy to see what we disagree with. What do we agree with in this ad? How can we put our own assumptions, particularly about gender, under the microscope? And I've argued that that relates not just to advertisements, but to a series of relationships, really between corporate America and medicine, because at least in the United States, we're now very good at kind of locking pharmaceuticals. We don't let drug ads in my hospital, detailers in my hospital anymore. Sadly for me, we can't get any more free pens or anything, which I find a super bummer. But so in a way, there's a kind of narrative about that we're kind of taking a stand. But I think there's a bigger issue about this, which really is about how we're also reinforcing things even as we reject them. A kind of related point has to do actually with cultural stereotypes. Now, I don't want you to think the message of what I'm saying today is that cultural stereotypes are bad. I think cultural stereotypes give us an important shorthand with which to convey our experiences of illness and health. And certainly if a patient comes into your office and says something like, I've had 2 weeks of depressed mood, I have had loss of interest, I have had whatever, and sounds like a robot, talking about the DSM, that's going to be far less, meaningful, really, as a clinician than somebody who comes in and says, I can't play with my kids anymore, I feel terrible, I feel bad as a mother, or a guy who comes in and says, I can't bite anybody's ear off anymore, or whatever, something like that. And so, in a way, what this is doing is kind of, I think it's important to say that at that moment, as a clinician, for example, it's not like what I'm saying is, well, sir or madam, you're suffering from a socially constructed illness, and what we need to do is change the culture, not treat the individual. But I think that these moments actually open up at least beginnings of conversations. And I've had the experience as a clinician where I've had women patients come in holding up some of the ads that I've written critically about. And so women come in and hold up these Prozac ads and say, this is me. I feel like I can't play with my kids anymore, or something like that. What can I do? And at that moment, again, the answer is not to say, well, that's just culture or something like that. It's to see how culture shapes people's experience of illness. And so at those moments, I think the right answer, as far as I'm concerned, is to say, well, what are your expectations or desires about what it is that Prozac might do for you? And then I can share my own expectations, and we can have a meaningful conversation about culture, whether or not I end up prescribing a medication. The other point relating to some stuff before was it's really interesting in doing this kind of study how little cultural language we have for talking about men's depression. So we just listed all the kinds of adjectives that were used to talk about women's emotions, and it was a really, really long list. But for men, it's really like you look through this and the Viagra literature and stuff like that, there really is just a shorter lexicon for men. I know the NIH and NIMH have tried to do this Real Men, Real Depression, but we actually coded that campaign also just to see, and it was a lot of like, I can't do my job, I can't do whatever, but it was like this really predictable stuff. So there really is is a shortage of language. I think if you look at culture at least, for talking about really it's not just men's depression, it's really men's emotions. And the last point I'll just say is that I think there's an important lesson here for psychiatry, because on one hand, we have these great tools like the DSM, which teach us in a way to control for cultural variables. What they teach us to do is to say, well, you might have your cultural language, but really what I'm trying to do is weed that out and see the real illness from the culture. And certainly, that's very important, but I also argue when I talk to psychiatric audiences that there's something important to be learned from medical advertisers who are actually incredibly astute students of popular culture. And certainly in the United States, it's true that when patients come into doctors' offices now, in part they're doing it because of symptoms, but also they're doing it because of these cultural messages. And if the lesson for doctors is, what we need to do is train you to just control for that by using the DSM that doesn't really, to my mind, teach you about a very complex analytic of how to understand culture, that in a way you're missing half of the reason of why patients are coming into doctors, and certainly the conversations that women and men are wanting to have about prescription medications. Thank you.